Hey, good evening. Welcome everybody to the second in ASI's Backcountry webinar series. And we're really delighted tonight to have some panelists with us that I know you're going to enjoy hearing from. So let me introduce them. Person you've probably not heard of, but which you should, Chip Gibbons, who's out at Fly Oz. He's flown in Arkansas for 40 years. He's a Gold SEAL, CFI, MEI, CFII. He's the one that built the airfield guide that many of you fly the backcountry are so familiar with. He's one of these guys that just works in the background. You don't hear much from him. So delighted to have Chip from Fly Oz with us. And we've also got Steve Gibbons here. I'm sorry, Steve Gibbons. We've also got Steve Johnson here, and I'm sure you know Steve. Steve started supercup.org, and he's also an instructor and works with Chip on the whole Fly Oz network, which we'll talk about a little bit later. If you haven't heard of that, you definitely need to hear that. You need to go fly there. So also a CFI and a backcountry instructor. So we're happy to have Steve here with us. And then somebody you probably wouldn't expect on a backcountry seminar, but we got Michael Goulian with us live from an air show somewhere. Michael, where are you? Some air show somewhere.
Detroit, Michigan.
All right, good. And you know Michael and his background, champion aerobatics performer, champion air racer, and has taken a liking to the backcountry and relatively new at it. So we all did some flying this summer in the backcountry, and we did it at Fly Oz out of Bentonville, Arkansas. And we thought it was a great chance to bring up, had a lot of questions on group flying in the backcountry and some tips on how to do that safely. So that's what we're going to talk to you about. So John, let's go to the next slide and we'll get right into the conversation. Oh, I can go to the next slide. Look, I'm already messing up. So I already mentioned the group, and so let's start off with just to talk about this topic of flying in the backcountry. I once sent a note out. There's a group of people called the Backcountry Safety Coalition. It's just a group of a dozen or so organizations and people that loosely formed to just try to help stewardship and safety in the backcountry. And this topic was controversial because some people really think you should not fly groups in the backcountry, period. So let me pitch that. You guys do a lot of that, Chip. I'm going to start with you. What do you think about this, and what are the pros and cons, and where's the cutoff? Where is it safe and where is it unsafe?
Well, yeah, for me, I really don't enjoy flying in large groups, especially doing any backcountry flying. It's just so easy to lose sight of the airplane in front of you. I don't want to fly in tight formation with people that I don't know and don't trust. So I usually, 4 airplanes, anything over 4 airplanes, I begin to get pretty nervous about. And if it's over 5, I suggest we break into more than one group and have some real separation between us. There's just so much going on. It's so easy to get too close to someone, especially in landing situations. So that's kind of I don't mind doing it, but I want it to be a small group and preferably pilots that I know and trust.
Yeah. Steve, any difference there and how you view it?
No, but just be aware that Chip only likes to be around about 4 people at once either. So, I mean, that's part of it. So, no, I agree.
And none of them are on this panel.
I agree completely, and I have been involved in some really big groups. We've done groups of over 30 airplanes flying at an event in Fall Colors event up in northern Minnesota, and we would all fly in trail, and it actually worked out fine, and we never had any problems in the many years we did it. But it's not ideal when there's mountains and things and obstacles and tight runways and things like that around. I think 4 and maybe 5 is a real good number.
Yeah, I think there, Chip, you made a point that it's not formation flying, and I totally agree with that. To me, when you talk formation flying, that implies a certain level of discipline, a certain level of proximity for the airplanes, and a structure to it that really, to me, really doesn't fit. But it's kind of a gray area because you still have several airplanes that are in the same piece of sky going the same way with the same objective. So there still needs to be some level of coordination, and you got to talk through some of those areas. And my view is, having done it, and I think every time I've flown, except for once, I once went with Andrew Simmons, and he and I were solo in the backcountry, I've been out there with a group, and I feel a comfort when I have other people around with me because, and there's a pretty famous incident with Todd Simmons, which he did a video with ASI that was really well received. And if he hadn't had a group with him, man, he'd have been in a world of trouble. There's a whole benefit in being in that remote part of the country and having some support with you.
Yeah, you may recall when you and I were flying together, going down to Birds Adventure Center, you looked around and asked me on the radio, what would you do if your engine quit? And I think I said, I'm going to depend on you to come bring me some help because it's going to get ugly. But yeah, no, you're right about that. It is nice to fly with a small group, somebody that you know, if you have an issue, they know where to find you and how to dig you out of there.
Or bring you parts, or, you know, and even it doesn't have to be a critical emergency. You sprain your ankle or you need somebody to run back to the airplane, get water. I just found that I found that my comfort level from doing it solo and being with a group to having that sort of mutual support was pretty strong, the difference between those two.
I think there's a key point, if you don't mind me jumping in for one sec. I think there's a key point in this, though. And I'm not saying this was a part of Todd Simmons' deal at all, but one of the problems sometimes when you get a group is there's some peer pressure to do things that maybe you don't feel like you should be doing. And so it's important to know the group that you're with and know that you're comfortable to say, hey guys, I'm going to orbit up here and watch you guys have fun, because there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I think that, you know, having everybody feeling like they have to do something is, you know, just not there. We did that the other day. We had 3 of us were out flying the other day. Laura and I had a lot of gas, and we just decided they hit one strip that we just decided we'd circle over the top and watch on that.
Yeah.
Richard, sort of to follow up what Steve was saying, I totally agree. And I think that the group, if they don't know, we'll find out tonight that the 4 of us went out flying and you guys introduced me to the backcountry and Chip. Now I get it. You put Steve out front, I was behind, Richard was behind me, and then you were cleanup Charlie. So you made Steve the guinea pig, the wind dummy, what we call an aerobatic flying, and then everybody else had me where they could see me because they didn't trust me. I get it. I see how this works now. But you know, when in the air show world, we do all of these formation flights together, and it's the same exact thing. You have to know who you're with, and you have to trust who you're with, and it's an interesting aspect of this that I found, because we didn't know each other. And the other thing is, you can start to take some of your brain bites and move them towards watching other people and following, getting caught up in that, and not following, you know, not flying your own airplane. You're following somebody else. And it's also interesting that I found, because we had 4 airplanes with 4 very different sort of performance levels of these airplanes, and you know, you could get caught up in this peer pressure where maybe your airplane doesn't perform as well as those, but you want to try to do that, and again, you just lose some of your attention on following the group, flying the formation, instead of actually taking care of your own business inside the airplane.
Yeah. So that group size comment, to me, what I like, the optimum group size to me is 3, which is a little unusual, you know, and I come from a military formation where it's out, you always try to even it up, 2 or 4, you know, whatever. But I liked that 3 because you could take 3 people, but you're not too worried about the accordion effect when you go into a field, right? Because the guy in trail 3 can go way back if he wants and he's not bothering anybody, and give 2 a lot of room. But once you add that 4th person, now you have those 2 in the middle, and you can get a little bit of an accordion effect. So I found, you know, I think you made the point earlier, Steve, 3 to me is a good group size. 4 is okay. 5 to me is too much. I would split up and go 2, 3 versus go 5. Okay. So here's where we flew, just to give you an idea. We didn't hit all of these strips, but this is the Fly Oz network, which is just a fantastic place to fly, but also a great place to go train before you go into some of the deeper, you know, country in Montana and Idaho. So Chip, you and Steve mind telling us a little bit about the Fly Oz network?
You want me to do that, Steve? You want to?
Yeah.
Okay. So in Arkansas, like in a lot of states that aren't out in the West, we have much more private land than we do public land. We don't have the opportunity to go land on BLM land or a lot of public kind of land. So what a group of us did, and it wasn't all the Fly Oz folks, there were several groups involved, went out to owners of airstrips that are private and cajoled and coerced and got people to agree to let other people use their airstrips, and it kind of built on itself. And there are, we've counted over 100 grass strips within about 100 miles of Bentonville. Now, not all the people that own them allow people to land there, but a lot do. And we found that other people kind of come on board as they begin to understand what the liability isn't and all of that. So this network of strips, we just love having people to come in and do training or just enjoy flying here. The DA is pretty low here generally, almost always below 4,000 feet. And so we can help people understand where to go. Our focus in the FlyOz network is what do you do once you get there? So we really enjoy being able to send people that like to fish to places where they can fish or paddle or mountain bikes and that kind of thing. So that's what Steve and I do, is kind of, we're concierges and we coordinate this group, this very loose group of airstrips.
I must say you did a fine job of coordinating the loose group that we had there, which loose was a pretty loose term for the people that we had there flying. We had an awful lot of fun though, I will tell you that.
It was great.
You know, every group is different, and that makes it the really part of the interesting part. You know, you have different skill levels and different personalities, and I think that's what continues to make it interesting as well too.
So let's talk about preparation and pre-flight. So if you look on the right of your screen there, you'll see ASI and the RAF teamed up, this was 3 or 4 years ago, I think, John, to make this guide to help it was sort of a combination guide. It's a briefing guide to help you get ready to go into different airfields, but it's also like a checklist for things that you want to bring along as you go into the backcountry. But it's a good place to start because it'll give you an outline of some of the stuff we're going to talk about tonight. It's free on the Air Safety Institute website. But the purpose of the briefing, and we'll show a little clip here in a minute of the one we did, is not so much like a very formal kind of formation briefing like, you know, Michael, the stuff you were talking about, air shows. You know, you got an air boss up there and he's very serious and it's very formal, it's very structured. That not so much needed back here as much, but what is needed is some of the same elements, and that is you have 4 airplanes or however many that are going to go in the same, from the same spot to the same spot at the same time in the same way. That requires some forethought and deconfliction. And so really, like all kind of formation or group flying, you're really trying to be predictable and eliminate uncertainty. That's the whole goal of a briefing. And so you'll want to establish a group, and our leader, because we forced him to be so, was Chip. He didn't volunteer to be so, but he had no option. And in all seriousness, he and Steve know that part of the country real well. They were the most experienced backcountry pilots we had out there. So Michael and I were happy to have Chip sort of walk us through where we're going to go to, what's kind of different of the fields, how we wanted to get there, and the kind of things we'll talk to you about. So you want to establish a group lead, and then you'll want to establish who's going to go in what order. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, some of the considerations. Talk about the overall route of your destination, some of the stuff, and then you'll want to just kind of walk through each phase of flight. And this didn't take very long. I think, well, we were doing a lot of joking around and drinking a lot of coffee in our briefing, so I think ours took longer, but it's typically, you can do a good briefing in a half an hour easy. What do you guys think? You guys do a lot of this, Chip and Steve, you always brief them. What does a briefing usually take you?
I think a half hour, 45 minutes is, yeah. You know, and it just depends on who it is, right, and what they want to do. So, I mean, we try to kind of, one of the other interesting things is try to say, all right, who is this guy and what's his skill level and where do we think he should go and shouldn't go, and try to help people make a plan based on that. So if you have a group, you got to kind of figure that in. You try to pick somebody in a group that's kind of a leader. And
it depends too, I think. I'm sorry. It depends too, I think, on how many airstrips you're trying to hit and where you're going. We found that it works a lot better to hit 2 or 3 airstrips and say we're all going to get out at this airstrip, and then we can brief the next airstrips, because people don't remember, you know, at all. And especially if you got Goulian, gee, man, what a challenge that guy was to
over and over.
Yeah, I mean, you guys had to spoon feed me the entire way.
progressives.
Yeah.
Okay, so some considerations on like start, taxi, and takeoff, and this just is so variable depending on where you're flying out of and where you're flying into. So when you're, for example, some of your considerations on start, some of the fields you'll go into in the backcountry in like Montana and Idaho and other places, Washington, Oregon, they're really tight. So you put a lot of thought into, okay, if we're going to try to go in the same way and same direction, how are we positioned and who's going to start first, and do we need to push airplanes out or so forth and not blow rocks back on each other? So some of these just take some time to think through, which for us, which is why it was so helpful to have Chip, because he knew all these fields, he knew how we were going to park, he knew how we were going to push the airplanes, and that helps you get started. Of course, traffic, and I'll show a video in a little bit about dust issues. You know, you're at usually unprepared airfields. So you've got some considerations that you don't normally when you're in sort of the front country with paved airfields, dust being one of them, or flying grass, or, you know, other things that can cause you an issue. Wake turbulence. I remember, Steve, the first time I flew with you in Fly Oz, and I asked you this question and said, hey, how much spacing should I take on you? And you said, hey, be careful, because a Super Cub throws out a surprising amount of wake turbulence, and it does. So back taxi and lineup considerations are things that you can talk about. And then, you know, we'll talk about climb out and en route. So these are all some of the things that you're going to talk about during your briefing phase. So,
even though it seems pretty elementary, I've messed it up before myself, where we have our order going, you know, it's going to be me and then Richard and then Steve and then Michael. And that's the way we taxi out, and we get to the end of the runway. It's like, oh, there's no room. All we can do is pirouette, and now we're in exactly the reverse order. So, you know, I know that seems like something you wouldn't do, but trust me,
you do.
that's a very doable thing.
yeah, right. So let's talk a little bit about some of the en route formations, and I made a pretty crude slide here, but these are some of the formations that work both, you know, outside of that, but also in the backcountry, depending on where you are, how low you are, whether you're down in canyons or whatever the case is. So probably my favorite one, so the first one on the left is just trail. And I remember us talking about this, Steve. What do you guys recommend? So let's say you're flying fairly typical backcountry airplanes like Huskies and Carbon Cubs and Super Cubs. When you establish yourself in trail like that, what kind of spacing do you guys look for, and how do you determine it?
Well, I think you want to easily see the person in front of you without being too close. So you should be in a situation where you're not going to lose sight of them. So if they're faster than you or whatever, then you kind of need to, if you have got an air-to-air frequency going, which hopefully you do, you'll discuss, you know, speed and spacing and that sort of thing. If it becomes far enough, then you become a separate group, right? So, but I think a half mile or a quarter mile, is that, Chip, what do you think? Is that?
I don't really know how to measure that. I just look at, I want to be able to see the person in front of me easily, and know that no matter what they do, no matter what maneuver they do, for whatever reason, that I'm safely behind that. So, you know, that's something you can kind of judge just by vision, but probably a quarter of a mile, I'm guessing.
Part of the reason, remember, part of the reason you're out there doing this is you want to look around and enjoy everything around you. If you're spending your entire time looking at the airplane that's 10 feet away from you, you don't get to look at the scenery. So that's kind of my happy medium, where I can go, okay, he's over there, and now I can look over and see this land feature or whatever.
Michael, you flew some of these. Did you get a feel for where it felt comfortable or not comfortable in trail and your distance and spacing when we were?
I think exactly what Steve said. You know, I wanted to look around. I wanted to sort of stay in a nice position, also comfortable out the windscreen. So I didn't want to have to lean forward and look or have an obstructed view from the wing. And then also, if the aircraft in front of me had some kind of an engine issue, I was not in the way. So if it did a glide because they had an engine out, there was no risk of any collision whatsoever. And then I was also in a position to help if they are panicking, trying to find a way to get the engine started, and allow the person in back to try to find a field and then guide them. Because you know, if you're flying along 1,000 AGL and you have some kind of a major engine issue out in the backcountry, there's a lot to do in a very short amount of time, is what I found.
Yeah, good. I found that flying in trail, I liked to fly a little bit high on the person in front of me. One, I'm out of the wake turbulence, so that's not an issue. And the second, Michael, that point that you made, of just being out of their way if they had to turn or slow down or for whatever reason. In the trail position, what I found was, and I did this on you the first time we flew together, Steve, was I got too far back as you dropped down into one of the canyons back there, and I lost sight of you, and I'm not familiar with it. So now I've lost the guy that's leading me into the airport to go in, right? So I had to climb up and get a little visibility. So that trying to strike that balance to me is kind of where you're trying to park.
And Richard, there's a lot to be said for that. Like I was new to this whole process, new to flying in this area. And I can't remember, Chip, whether it was you or Steve that started the process in the beginning, but I was close enough where I basically just followed what you did, right? Like his path, his speed, his angle, everything. I just basically monkey see, monkey do until I started to get the hang of it. And so that was far enough away where I wouldn't run you over on landing. You were able to roll out to the end. I had enough spacing, but yet I still saw exactly the track that your airplane flew as it went around and over obstacles and down into the landing position.
Right. You know, contrary to the way you prefer to do it, Richard, I like to be a little below the person in front of me just so I can see them better. I don't lose them in the trees, or, you know, it's easier for me to pick somebody out if I have blue behind them.
Yeah, you know what I found is,
Got a couple questions coming in, Richard, when you're ready.
okay, yeah, we're going to take some questions here in a second. One comment on that, what I found was Steve's white Super Cub was really hard to see looking up with sort of a pastel blue and white background. On the other hand, we were coming back at dusk one time, kind of, I think, and Michael, you were in the Wheeling, the Watt Carbon Cub, and that thing was lit up, and you could see that at any angle, so it didn't really matter there. But those lights really helped a lot in terms of visibility, because if I like to see everybody. If I'm number 3, I not only want to see 2, I want to see 1, and right. So I could just find Michael and then follow up from there.
When Mike was flying through there, that's the first time we've ever gotten light complaints. We've gotten noise complaints before, but actually bright light complaints we got when he was flying that plane.
Yeah. John, why don't we
pick on the new guy?
Why don't we stop and take some questions? Yeah, it's good. You guys up for some questions? A little Q&A? Sure. Okay.
Okay, sure, guys. The first question that came in is actually more of a comment, but Chris does backcountry planning with larger groups and aircraft of varying capabilities and speed. And he suggested that they make their own way to the backcountry airport, and they maintain a distance of about 5 miles. So they each get there and they come in on their own. It's a little bit different from how you guys were doing it on your flights.
Yeah.
I don't think that's bad. You lose some of the advantage of being closer together in case something goes wrong for somebody. That's one of the things you lose there. That's not group flying. That's just 5 people flying to the same airport at different times.
Yeah.
So another question came in. Phil wanted to know, while in level en route flight, should the lead plane communicate their GPS ground speed to the rest of the group?
So it's a good question. We're going to get into that a little bit later, but I find it really helpful if the lead is communicating ground speeds. And I think Steve, you or Chip were doing that on the route that we took out there, from what I remember. And all of us have it. We all have our GPSs in the airplane. And that just, because you're flying so far back so when you fly formation, there's a sweet spot. At some point, if you fly too close, it's really hard. If you fly too far, it's really hard. There's a sweet spot in there where it's really easy to see the planes maneuver. But you're so far away, you can't really see any closure, and you're in trail a lot. And so you don't see any closure. So that's really helpful to get a ground speed readout from the lead pilot.
This is a place where ADS-B comes in super handy, because you can click on that lead plane and it'll tell you how fast they're going too. So if you've got everybody in the group equipped with ADS-B, I know a lot of people hate it, a lot of people like it, whatever. It's really handy when you're doing this kind of flying, especially if the visibility starts to tank.
Yeah, I agree. Really, I found it really helpful. Yeah, and it brings up another point. In formation flying, usually only the lead squawks and everybody else strangles. But in this flying we're doing, it's helpful if everybody's squawking and got their ADS-B on.
So one last question before we move on. Guy asked, what does a group need to keep in mind to avoid being encumbered by the FAA's formation flying rules?
Well, the FAA formation flying rules are really pretty loose. I mean, they're not that tight. You just have to brief whatever you're going to fly, and that's really, from memory, I think that's about all the FAA requires you to do. So you cover that by doing the briefing that we're talking about. So I guess that you guys got any different response to that?
No, really what we do is more gaggle flying than it is formation flying. You know, I wouldn't even classify it as formation flying. And that's one of the things that we have to think about if we're going through some airspace and you're a quarter mile or half mile apart to call out a flight, is pretty confusing. So usually we're far enough apart that we don't even qualify as a flight.
Yeah. So a couple of these other formations. So the trail is one where you're directly in trail. That's not typically my favorite. I typically like to stagger it. And I will say that I think out of all of these, the trail is probably my favorite formation for the point you mentioned, Michael. You're back there for a reason and you want to look around and have some fun. You can do a little bit of S-turns or rock your wings and take a look at something without really messing somebody else. And a staggered trail just makes it that much easier, because I always like to, if I'm looking for something, to me, it's always easier if it's isolated off one side of my cockpit. If I'm flying in trail and I lose somebody, I don't know if they're left or right of my nose, so I have to kind of wander a little bit. But if I've offset them a little bit, I know they're on that side, and I know I have a bailout direction to, in this case, the right side. So out of these, do you guys have any preferences or any formation you tend to fly a lot of?
We generally fly like the second diagram there, where there's a little bit of a stagger, a little bit of an offset for exactly the reasons that you mentioned.
And also, it's good. One of the things that's good to talk about is what's the bailout direction. Somebody needs to bail out. In that case, maybe left is the way to bail out. If you fly the other way with a different kind of stagger, right? That's the expected bailout if somebody's got to get out of that group for some reason.
Yeah, yeah. Then there's the loose diamond formation, which you can use when the terrain is not so dramatic, or maybe you're above the terrain, then you can do that. I flew in the backcountry a little bit with Dick Williams and his son Patrick, and we were doing some of these, and then a Vic formation, which is really there's no slot there. It's just leads on a point, and wings on either side. If you're going to do that one, and we did that a little bit in Montana last year, if you're going to do that one, you just want to make sure that you establish that the lead's airplane is a firewall, that the person on the right goes no farther left than the right wingtip of the lead, and the person on the left goes no farther than the left wingtip of the lead. So establishing that, you'll have some deconfliction, and you can do the same thing, and it makes it a little more compressed, and it's can be fun as well. And then finally is the fingertip. And I really haven't found much of opportunity to use that or fly. I just don't find that particular formation very helpful in the backcountry. Anybody, anything different on formation there to offer, guys? Nope.
The only thing
Yeah,
that
Richard, I would say
said was that the stagger is better for taking pictures.
Okay. What were you going to say, Michael?
Yeah, there you go. No, I was just going to say, again, I think I came into this with a bunch of formation experience from my airshow world, but if I bought a new backcountry airplane and I was just getting into this and I was going to start to fly with a group, there is enough sort of training that I think needs to happen just to go out to fly with this group before you head out into the backcountry, just so you can experience it, even if it's just out 5 miles out, do some turns, do some circles, communicate with the group, understand how it works, come back and land and say, okay, I have that out of the way. I don't need to worry about that. It's just one of those stress things. I think that if you've not done it before, it's like when people go to Oshkosh and the closest they ever come to an airplane is on the downwind at Oshkosh, and people get pretty nervous there. And if you're in that category, I think going out and just getting comfortable flying together before you went out into the backcountry would probably be a good idea.
Yeah, be helpful. Okay. So somebody brought up a question about communications. So Chip, how about, would you run through the way you briefed us to use our communications when we were group flying back there?
Yeah, we have most of our airstrips, if they're close to another active airport, we generally use that airport frequency, like Sugar Creek being close to Bentonville. At Sugar, we use the Bentonville frequency. Otherwise, everything we have out there is 122.9. In flight, I know a lot of people use fingers, they like that, but it's so congested that we usually will find something different. But the main thing is write it down someplace. Don't make sure you remember what it is, so that 4 radio calls later, you know how to get back to it. But I think we probably use 2275. I think maybe that's what we tend to use here. That's what I tend to use.
Yeah. So in like Montana and Idaho and back there deep in those canyons, I found it really helpful to have whoever was leading was always on 122.9 making the communications and the calls coming through, wherever. And if you had 2 radios, you could monitor that and just listen. If not, though, you would stay on the interflight freak, and the lead would come back and talk to you. So if you've got if people have multiple radios, it becomes really easy and comfortable. You've got an interflight 12275, and you got 1229 that really only your lead is talking on, because he's talking about, we got 4 huskies coming up, the canyon into Lower Loon, or whatever the call is. So so I found that helpful, and then you can do all your chatter. And I want to pause here and mention, I mentioned I did some flying with Dick Williams and his son, and one of the more beneficial things I've ever done in my backcountry flying was, I kind of took the same approach you did, Michael. It was something I hadn't done a lot of, and so I wanted to go with somebody that I knew could help me walk through and explain, teach some of these the nuances of backcountry flying. And I would follow Dick along and have him talk through the different points, kind of like Chip, you and Steve were doing with us. Like, what is the point here? What airspeed are you flying? How about your flap setting here? And just having them talk through what they're thinking through, because every pattern you fly is non-standard in the backcountry, every strip you go to. So having somebody walk you through that, I found was just really beneficial. So that communications was helpful. This is really important, though. When groups and formations get in trouble, so we'll take a lesson learned from formations here, is that you really shouldn't assume anything. You have to have positive confirmation that you did a brief, so you know what the plan is, and if there's any changes to that plan, which there always is, then they need to be communicated, and then you need to hear everybody in that group acknowledge it. So being really careful where formations get in trouble and where they really tend to bang into each other is somebody assumed somebody else heard something, or somebody assumed that a pilot was going to make a move, or they went blind on him and assumed they were going to maintain the same direction. Assumptions are a really bad thing when you're flying with a group in the same kind of piece of sky. So arrival, landing, and parking. So these are some of the spacing considerations you want to talk about. And I think we have some videos in here where we can talk a little bit about these. But again, this is kind of in the briefing session of all the things that you want to talk about. Yeah, designated areas, we talked about that. The leave no trace. Let's just pause a little bit and talk about stewardship in the backcountry. I know that's big for you guys, Chip and Steve, especially because you do a lot of private land. A lot of those strips we get to fly on back there, the owners are just generous enough to let us land there. So can we talk just a little bit about the importance of stewardship in the backcountry?
Steve, you want to take that?
Yes. So it's super important. I mean, here's somebody that has their property. They're actually mowing a place and putting in a lot of work. So, we maintain some of these airstrips ourselves, and we know the kind of work that goes into keeping one of these deals up. And these places are beautiful, and they're allowing us to come in and use this property for no charge at all. So, making sure that we take as best care of it as we can, leaving it better if we can when we leave. I mean, it's number one. And the other thing that goes right into that is noise. And, that's a big deal for us in this area because, again, they have neighbors. They would like to have good relationships with their neighbors. So we try to be sensitive to that. If there's noise sensitive areas, we really try to follow those to try to make it such that we're not exacerbating any problems with noise sensitivity.
Yeah. Something that really impacted me, I was down along I think it was the Salmon River in Idaho a couple years ago. We were talking to some rafters, and we had parked there and we're just hanging out picnicking. And they told us that they had waited a couple years to get their lottery ticket so they could get a rafting slot to go down that river. And that just really made an impact on me, that here's this person that's waited all this time to get to float down this river. And I can do just a little bit of courtesy, help their experience be a good one and not make an enemy. So I agree with you.
Everybody likes a 185 at 3,000 RPM.
There is no sound like that in it is a very distinctive sound. So, all right, let's get through. And then post landing, of course, talk about, you can just real quickly talk about, did everything go? And I think every place we would land, we would all get out and say, hey, how'd that go? What different? Did the formation work? Did it not work? Hey, why weren't you on this freak? It doesn't have to be pointed or in your face, but you're just trying to understand. We want predictability, and we don't want to have to make assumptions. So you're trying to eliminate those. And then the brief, departure from the backcountry airfields is kind of like the arrival process that we talked about, is making sure that you just talk through the different nuances of whatever strip that you're at, noise considerations we talked about, emergency actions that you would take, and the different hazards.
Remember, you got to unmute, Richard.
On a person right in front of you. So we did a staggered takeoff here, and you don't want to blow debris. So if the runway is wide enough, you can, use all the runway by just taking staggers, so you're not blowing stuff off of each other. And then you can notice on the takeoff, what I've found is it's really helpful to know where the wind's coming from, because as soon as lead lifts off, you can see them weather vane into the wind. That's where their wake turbulence comes, and everybody can just shift a little bit upwind of the first guy to take off, and now you're outside the wake turbulence. I think we have another one, John, that shows where we can do where the runway's a little narrower. So here's a case. I think this is Banks Ranch, isn't it, Stephen Chip?
It is. Yeah.
Here's a case where the runway's not wide enough to do that kind of staggered thing. So we all just went in trail, and if you count, I want to say this is probably about 20-second spacing, maybe 25-second spacing. And we didn't have to worry about wake turbulence as much, because there's a pretty strong left to right crosswind coming on the day we went here.
What I say about that trip is that the weather was terrible for 4 days waiting to fly, and on the 4th day, we went anyway.
With the winds, that was the case. So yeah, there was some, and I think we have an en route formation couple videos, John. So let's show those. So here you can get an idea of how blustery it was that day. But Chip, I think this is you out in front, and we're flying the Vic formation here. And this is really a little bit closer than what you need to fly. You'd really want to. I think we did this so we could show the formation itself. But you can see how kind of the firewall happens between, where that lead establishes, and the person on the right stays on the right no matter what, and on the left stays on the left. And you have some deconfliction, easy to look around. Pretty nice, simple cruising formation to fly.
That formation is a little tighter than I would normally fly doing backcountry stuff. I'm sure that was for the camera ship. That was a photo op, I assume. It was Steve out front. The poor flying was Steve, not me.
Yeah, it was. And one of the few times that lead was not in position was in that video.
It's true. It's also, as you recall, lead hit turbulence that just about knocked him out when he hit the top of the cage too.
But yeah, for it's an interesting video, but again, that's a little tighter than I would fly a formation backcountry, especially with people that I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. That in that particular formation, you wouldn't be able to look around as much as we wanted to. So I think, after we weren't filming it, we spread out a little bit. Arrival, landing, and parking. So there is a good arrival video in here I wanted to show how we were taking spacing. So one of the big considerations is how you're going to take spacing on when you come in to land, and keep in sight of the person in front of you, but also being able to get enough spacing where it depends on some of the fields back there. They're too narrow, and so you have to know, can you land and the people in front of you are going to taxi off the runway, or is it so narrow where they're not able to do that and they have to turn around and back taxi on the runway? And so you've got to have enough spacing to allow them to land and back taxi and exit the runway before you come in and land. So again, just another reason why it's helpful to have somebody who's been there before and can sort of brief these things so you don't surprise yourself. Let's see if
We're getting comments and you can't hear you talk while the video is running, so
okay.
we'll just run the video and have you guys talk afterwards.
Okay. I think this was Banks 2. Steve's out front, and we've decided we're going to go in. 1, 2 was on the right. I think I was number 2 here in the yellow. And 3 was going to come in behind. So you can see the places to take spacing. Oh, I forgot not to talk. See, can you guys hear me? Steve, thumbs up if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So you see Steve is now making his turn to either base or final. I can't tell. And you'll notice I'll extend out just a little bit to start my spacing, as will the person behind me. And so we can still keep each other in sight while getting our spacing, both to turn to what's kind of a base or kind of a final. And a good rule of thumb that the Williams taught me, Dick and his son Patrick, is when they'll come in the backcountry and they're looking at a field, what they will often do is try to take spacing so that they're on upwind while the other person is kind of on a downwind. And again, all the patterns in the backcountry are just a little bit funny. So upwind and downwind can look really funny. But basically, they're on the opposite side of the runway. And if they find themselves there, that's usually enough spacing to keep the person in sight and follow them down and come in through. So I found that as a good rule of thumb.
I think this is an area where people get in a lot of trouble when they're new to group flying. I learned about density altitude doing this in Marble. I was following a guy flying a really slow airplane, and I just got too close. If you've ever flown in Marble, there's a kind of almost a canyon turn. There's a really tight turn to final, and I was simply too close. He landed, and his airplane, he just couldn't taxi fast enough to get out of my way, or he'd be flying again. He was in a Hewlett Courier, so it was so I had to go around. So I learned about density altitude in a short wing airplane that day, but I think the go arounds that you have to make can be really exceedingly dangerous, because now you're trying to get back in line. You haven't maintained eyesight with the other people that are coming in. So now you have an 8 ship and you're number 2 and you're going around. You don't know where 6, 7, and 8 are. It's just, this is a really tricky part of the whole gaggle flying in the backcountry. I think people tend not to give themselves enough room on landing.
Yeah, I've found that to be the case. Now, so this was kind of the first time that you had done this, Michael. How did you find that and you hadn't been to any of these strips before, so it was important for you to keep track of Chip there. How are you finding that?
You know, Richard, I felt that it was fine. I was actually pretty concerned with the landings, right? And that we did a lot of preparation on halfway down the runway. On this runway, there'll be a fall off to the right. Make sure you don't do that. And then as you roll out to the end, there's a roll off on the left. So I was pretty prepared to be a good long distance away from the person in front of me, because I felt, for me, the challenge was making sure that I made an on-speed approach and put the airplane down where I wanted it to be, and have a presence of mind to pay attention to all of the things that were briefed. So I probably gave more spacing to Chip and to Steve than I would have after I've done it one time.
Yeah.
But the other part of that, I think, is if you are in front and you've done this enough, you know that you need to keep moving. You know, after you've landed, right, I've got somebody behind me. I've got to keep moving, or I got to get off this runway. Or it's also incumbent on me to make the next guy safe.
Yeah, it's one of two things, right? You land and you immediately get off the runway, or you land and if you've got a taxi all the way to the end, then you hustle up and get down there, and then realizes, you know, you're the number 2 behind you. You may very well have to land while somebody's still on the runway, and that's just something you're going to have to accept.
And you know, in any type of group flying, there's always varying levels of experience, and obviously in this realm, I had the least experience. So when you think of leading somebody else, I always think about, how am I going to make the person that I'm leading as safe as they can be, right? That's another aspect of it, is if I'm in charge of this flight, I'm also in charge of the safety of everybody else, and especially the person with the least experience, which would have been me.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So John, there's one more video I think I want to show, which is if we go to, we did a departure off of, I think this was off of Cougar. And Chip was talking about a mistake he made, and I want to share a similar mistake I made. So you can't, the video doesn't quite show it as well, but it's really dusty, so the visibility wasn't good. If you look at the very top, you can see Dick and his son up circling, waiting for me to take off. And I'm waiting to try to get a little visibility. I'm waiting, so I'm sure there's no wake turbulence. And I'm also thinking, what's my best route to climb out of this canyon? So you can see to the left, it goes down the canyon and the river, but it kind of gets narrowed down there. I didn't want to go down there too far. I wanted to do like they were doing, take a little bit of offset, drive towards that canyon wall right there, or that ridge, and then make a turn back where there was also a little ridge, and I forget the name of the airfield. Steve, you probably know it. It's right above Cougar. There's another one that's right up there on the shelf. And this,
Not off the top of my head.
pardon me?
Off the top of my head, I don't.
Yeah, I can't remember. But I make this turn too early. I should have extended down that river valley a little bit and gotten some more speed, but I start this turn back early, and you can see that that ridge is just a little more of an issue than I expected it would be. And there's an airport, there's a little, that strip I'm talking about is right out in front of me there. And thankfully that was there and flat, and I could just level off and climb for a while. The whole point of that being, when you're flying with different airplanes, you've got to fly your own airplane. And sometimes it means having to say, I can't do that. I can't keep up with that airplane. I'm not that fast. I don't climb that well. And in some cases, I don't have the skill to do that. And Michael, you make a good point of, if you're a lead, you want to try to make sure that you don't put people in that position, but you can't always do that. And so you're relying on them to know their airplane and how they're going to fly it.
Yep.
You know, one of the things I want to give a shout out to Michael on this trip as well too, because one of the things that was, I think both Chip and I talked about afterwards was, you know, you're an expert in what you do. You know, you're an amazing aviator and you do amazing things, but the way you approach this as being the new guy and with a willingness to learn is something I think that's important for people to realize, that everybody has to go through that. Just because you're an amazing pilot at doing one thing, another aspect of aviation takes some focus and some learning in that as well too. We really appreciated your approach to the flying you did here with us.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. And again, I think in my aerobatic background, and I teach so many aerobatic students as well, is that there are things that you can learn in 1 hour of dual instruction in an aerobatic airplane that it would take 100 hours to figure out on your own. Or sometimes there's tricks on how to do maneuvers that you could never figure out on your own. And I took that to this type of flying, is that, yeah, I could sit there and just sort of fight my way through this back home in Boston on a bunch of grass strips and things, or I could go to a bunch of experts, because I want to get more involved with you guys. I want to do more of this kind of flying. I want to be better in this airplane, but I don't have a lot of time to do it. I'm still flying full-time air show schedule. I do a lot of stuff in our flight school with all of our Cirruses, and oh yeah, fly the Wad Cub as well as I can also. So since I don't have all this time to practice, I looked at it as get involved with experts, try to make your learning curve as steep as possible, but for as short a time as possible. And that's sort of why I took that approach to it.
I don't know if you remember, Michael, when we were going into Richland Creek and you were following me, you were number 2, I think, and we made that right-hand traffic, made the turn, and I heard you say, oh, oh, I see. Oh, okay. That's how we're going to do it. I got it.
Exactly.
So,
Yep.
Yeah, we appreciated you very much.
There's a bunch of aha moments on that trip.
Yeah, good
For
stuff.
sure.
Well, John, do we have any more questions that have come in?
Yeah, we do.
Okay, we'll take a few more. We'll take a few questions if you guys don't mind.
So this is a very good question. Came in a little bit earlier. Ernst wants to know, how do you handle approaching an airport as a group when another aircraft not part of the group is also approaching? Let's say there's enough separation for the first two in your group to land, but not the third. What is the communication like to the other traffic?
Anybody want to take a crack at that?
It's a really great question because it does happen. I think in that case, you're, and really on landing, you become less of a group, right? So I think in that case, you just have to mix them in somehow. And if it means going out and circling a little bit and waiting, that's obviously the best choice. So, and hopefully you're talking with those people on the same frequency, whether you're on in our area 122.9, Idaho is the same way on the kind of the backcountry frequency. And hopefully you can coordinate that way.
Yeah, I agree with that. You wouldn't exclude people like, oh, get out of the way and let our group land, right? It's not that mindset. It's okay, great. Third person circles or goes out or extends downwind or whatever.
I think it's another call for keeping your group relatively small. We were in Idaho going into, I don't remember where, coming from the south, 5 of us, and another group was coming in from the north. There were about 5 or 6 of them, and it becomes a real issue. You got to communicate. How are we going to deal with this? And it's, if you only have 2 or 3 airplanes, it's so much easier to manage.
Any more questions, John?
Yeah, I think there's a comment that kind of goes towards that communications issue. Wendy suggests, don't bring pilots in your group that won't or can't shut up. And I think it's an important communication point.
Wendy, I resemble that.
Yeah. There is another question. Steve asked, any comments on matching specific aircraft to specific backcountry flying opportunities? Not every aircraft owner has a 185, a Husky, or a Super Cub, unfortunately.
So you want to take that too?
Go ahead. Somebody want to take that?
Well, I can say that there are a lot of places in Alaska and Idaho and Colorado I would not fly anything short of a really backcountry airplane. But there are places like we have intentionally designed strips. Sugar Creek's a great example. Trigger Gap's a great example that people can take 172s and especially 182s. We love to see people come into the backcountry in 182s. See, we had a great guy out of Colorado, I think, that came in a 150 last year, and that was a great airplane. He had a ball. So I just think you have to look at where you're going, and not all strips are suitable. I wouldn't take a 172 into the steep pitch at Banks, but there are, I would certainly take it into Jake's Ridge. So you got to match it. You got to know your airplane and match it. And then to me, what you have to do if you're coming here is sit down or get on the phone with Steve or myself and say, here's what I'm flying. Here's my experience. What would you suggest? You got to go ahead.
One of the first things we'll say there is, what's your performance stuff look like? We have people that come here in 206s and 210s, and in some iterations of those airplanes work great here and other ones don't. And so, you got to look at the performance, weight, density, altitude, all that sort of stuff. You really need to have an understanding of what your plane's ability to do. And then you can use, like Sparky Imeson or one of these folks, rules of thumb to try to determine all kinds of other factors. Is the grass going to slow me down? If the grass is long, how much more is it going to slow me down? Is it uphill, downhill? There's a lot of things to take into consideration. And then, of course, you want to leave yourself a pretty good margin.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question here from Kevin. Do you ever do seaplane backcountry?
I haven't. Have you
I
guys?
thought all seaplane flying was backcountry. Or it's backwater, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Bill Kilgore has a good question. Are y'all going to discuss outs, turn radius, and density altitude climb gradient?
Outs was the first one?
Outs was the first one.
Yeah. Sure. Anybody want to jump it? I'm not sure. Does he mean by like what we were talking about, bailouts or?
I think that's what he's
like
going
bailouts. And maybe he means in terms of, we talked about in terms of, the formation, knowing which way you can bail out so you're not a conflict with anybody. But I think it works knowing your bailout in terms of which direction are you going to go if you're not suited to go into that strip, or it seems too complicated for you, or the winds are too high, or the weather's dropping. So I don't know about you guys, but one of the things I always say, I just landed today, flew a Bonanza from Florida, and the weather's a little sketchy, but I always think about the bailout direction I'm going to go if it's more sketchier than I'm expecting. So to me, that's knowing your outs and which direction is huge.
I would go back to try to find somebody who's been to where you're going. Like if I were going to fly a low powered airplane into Idaho, I just wouldn't do that without finding someone, an instructor or someone I could talk to that could help me understand where maybe I shouldn't go. And you don't have to go out there and learn this on your own. That's not always the best way to do this. There are plenty of people that can help, so reach out to those people.
Yeah, I think that brings up a good point too, Chip, that a lot of these strips back here are one-way strips and no go-around strips, and that's usually synonymous. If it says one way, it means at some point when you cross a particular point, the airplane has to go on the ground one way or the other. And so you must obviously know that before you get in that situation. You know that, okay, once I pass this point, I have no bailout. I'm putting this airplane on the ground.
Right.
You know, the old thing we all learned in pilot training, that the FAA wants us to know all the details about the airport of intended landing. It applies more to this than it even does when you're flying into, a big 10,000 foot runway.
Yeah. Did we address everything that was in that question, John? Did we hit all the?
He also asked about density altitude. And so my point on that would be, again, get with an instructor. I promise you, if you've not flown in high density altitude areas, you don't understand density altitude. You don't appreciate density altitude. It is amazingly strangling to an airplane. And, I didn't learn that until I've been flying for 40 years and kind of learned it on my own. So yeah, I would say, again, get some instruction if you can. Find out the local, what people that live there do is the best advice I can give. And, try to not to get in that situation for the first. You don't want to experience that for the first time by yourself in an underpowered short wing airplane.
Well, even Michael, you deal with that, I'm sure, even flying your extra, as powerful as that thing is, the difference in your performance and density altitude, I'm sure.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about that. So a famous place that we all fly at some point in our career is at Reno, right? At the air show at the Reno Air Races. And when we go, as a person that lives in sea level like I do, I go out there a week in advance, and I just start with basically loops at 500 feet, hammerheads at 500 feet, hammerheads with a vertical roll, loops with snap rolls, and then you just start getting lower and more complicated as you go over 5 days. So when I'm going to fly at the Reno Air Races, it's actually it's about 10 days for me, 4 to 5 days of practice, then the event itself. And if you're going to be safe as an airshow pilot, you just have to do that. There's no way, if you don't live in that environment, to go out there, because it looks different, it feels different. And then even within that, so whatever Reno is, I think it's 5,000 feet. And so Reno at 70 degrees is a completely different place than Reno at 85 or 90 degrees when the wind is blowing 20. So I would get in the habit of turning on the AWAS, listening to the density altitude, and when it got above 9,000 feet, you knew it was going to be a difficult day. And then the airplane doesn't run the same, it doesn't fly the same. It's happy doing some things, it's really unhappy doing other things. You just can't pull on the wing. And as the question talked about, what's your turn radius and your turn rate? Well, when you're at high DA like that, the airplane just doesn't work. And so again, I went to Bentonville with all of you guys to learn this thing. I don't think I would have started in Idaho in August as my first step into this, right? So I'm excited to kind of go to the next step, but I wouldn't have done this progression. I wouldn't have jumped into Idaho. I'm just like, hey, come here. It's 2,000 and 3,000 and 4,000 feet of density altitude with not super challenging locations to fly into and out of, and then go to the next one. So again, for me, safety with everything in aviation, whether it's aerobatic flying or this backcountry flying or instrument flying or whatever it is, it's just a building block approach. as you gain more experience, you get more and more challenged.
Great. Well, I think we're out of time. So I
Yeah,
want to.
we have one question I think we should probably end on.
Okay.
Jessica wants to know, do y'all have any book recommendations, educational and/or just good stories?
Yeah, we got a lot of good stories. Some of them true.
You know, you've got a bunch. You've got some of those on the Air Safety Backcountry flight site. I think you know, Amy Hoover and Dick Williams' new book on backcountry flying is the new Bible. The old Bible of you know, put out by Sparky Emerson, got a lot of great rules of thumb in it. Still, the work that Galen Hanselman did in Utah and Idaho and those places is also just really great information. There's videos and things out there as well too, but those are all really great pieces of information. And the kinds of things Michael's talking about, those don't change. You know, where technology is not changing density altitude.
Yeah.
We know it better, but
yeah. Thanks for pitching that, Steve. The Air Safety Institute has a backcountry website that you can go to, and it's really just a funnel that'll send you to some of the other sites, FlyOb and some other places where you can get really good information. So start there, and you'll find good book recommendations there. And I agree with Steve that one that Dick and Amy wrote is a great place to start.
If I could throw one in, it's not an instructional book. It's called Flying South by Barbara Roll, I believe. It is a fantastic book. I think it's out of print, so you're going to have to go like online to find it. You won't find it in the bookstore, but really a great read. She did a beautiful job writing the book. So that's the one I always recommend for entertaining reading about flying.
Well, so I want to thank you guys. Michael, I know you're on seeing an air show and how busy that gets. And so thanks for taking a Thursday evening and spending some time talking about backcountry flying. It was sure a lot of fun seeing you and just watching the process of how you learn a different element of flying. And I learned a lot about just watching how you learn that.
Well,
Steve,
thanks. It's been fun. It's been really fun, actually.
It has been a lot of fun. Steve and Chip, long day of flying, and yet you give some time for the webinar. I sure appreciate that, and really appreciate all you're doing with the FlyOz network and all you're doing in the Backcountry Safety Coalition to help us all be better and safer.
You bet.
Thank you, guys. We'll see you in the backcountry.
good night.
Good night, everybody.
All right, before we go, let me give you a little bit of information about how you can get your wings credit, your AOPA webinar badge, and if you're looking for a certificate from the ASI transcript, we can do that as well. First of all, some resources here. We'll just leave these up for a brief moment, and then we'll move on here. But if you are not sure if you signed up for this webinar using your FAAsafety.gov email address that you used to establish your wings account, you can send it to us via the comment section or the question section, or you can send it directly to me, John Collins, Manager of Aviation Safety Programs, at John, John, .collins, COLLINS, at AOPA.org. I'm happy to add you to the list that we'll be sending into the FAA to get you wings credit for this seminar. Just one last summing up, you guys can read that. And while we're reading that, I do want to say a thank you to Aviat Aircraft for sponsoring this series of backcountry webinars. They are a very good partner for us. For the wings credit, like I said, just put it in the email, in the question area, or you can email it to us. Also, for your webinar badge, if you go to the AOPA app and click into Pilot Passport, if you look up there at the item mark number 2, that's the menu. If you click on that, that'll open up. You'll see Pilot Passport. Click on My Pilot Passport number 3, and then in the page that opens there at the very bottom is the affiliate code. You can put that code in there. That code is at the top of this slide, ASI Web 071422. Again, ASI Web 071422. That's available through the end of the month. So make sure you take advantage of that. Get the badge at 1,000 points. It'll move you up on the leaderboard. If you want transcript credit, please copy this link down, and that is goes to our online learning center. You can get credit there for attending the webinar as well. In a couple of weeks, we're all going to be out at Oshkosh, and we're going to have some fun out there. So if you're heading out there, please stop by and say hi to us. We'll be at the AOPA tent across from the Brown Arch, and we will have a whole series of webinars there. If you want some more backcountry information, you can see we have several seminars that will be on backcountry. You'll be able to talk to Richard and others, as well as if you're interested in becoming a STOL pilot, or if you've got questions about other safety related concerns, VFR into IMC. We're going to be talking about thunderstorm avoidance. Pilot mental health is going to be an excellent roundtable. So I invite you to stop by, say hi, and we'll look for you out there. So on behalf of Richard, Chip, Mike, and Steve, myself, John, thank you for watching, and fly safe.